Hi everyone. Welcome to the 2020 Town Hall for Cox Campus. We're live streaming this event. I just want to say hello and welcome to Dr. Marianne Wolf from California or in California and Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett in Boston. We're just going to get started in a couple of minutes, welcoming everyone in. So we'll just give everyone a few more minutes. As you guys are logging in on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and Instagram, please tell us where you're from, who you are, and why you joined us this afternoon. We're excited to hear from you. All right, so you'll see my eyes diverting a little bit away from the screen. I've got a few screens going on here, so I'm just trying to keep everything together. Hey, Virginia Baker, welcome. A lot of folks logging in from Georgia. Welcome. So this town hall event is a 2-hour event. In the first hour, we're going to be talking about our children from birth to 5 years old. And in the second part, we're going to be talking about our children in the kindergarten through third grade space. So we welcome all of you, educators and families alike. I'm so glad you decided to join us. Few more minutes or few more seconds to let more folks log in. Hey, Jackie from Tampa. Got a lot of Atlanta educators, Florida educators. So excited that you guys are coming in. Regina Brown, one of our partners at our partner sites at Sheltering Arms, welcome. So before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to extend a huge thank you on behalf of the Rollins Center at the Atlanta Speech School for everyone joining us. Thank you to all of our team who helped make this event possible. We also want to thank all of our partners, our local and our national partners, and of course, our funders who make the Cox campus free and accessible universally. So thank you all. Cannot forget our 115,000 members and counting all across the US and in various countries around the world. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I'm gonna start by just sort of saying that over the last few months, our country has been dealing with a lot. We've experienced a lot, and arguably our children are most affected. And so we wanted to convene everyone, all of our national audience and our international audience this afternoon to talk about ways that we can be better for our children and with our children. And so with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett from Boston. She's going to begin to speak to us this afternoon first, and then we'll move to Dr. Wolf. After that, we'll have some 15 minutes of Q&A. So please continue to chat us, share your questions, share your comments, and we'll get to as many of them in the last 15 minutes as we can.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be with you all this afternoon. Thank you all for showing up. Thank you all for caring and coming in together in community to discuss such a vitally, urgently important issue that's facing every child and every family right now in this country and in many places around the world. So, pandemic. A word that we have used probably ad nauseum over the past few months, but a word that before now we had rarely used. You know, let's face it, COVID-19 has not only impacted all of us in profound and different ways, it's impacted our lives, our hopes, our dreams, and our visions of the future. And it's had a disproportionate impact on communities of color. Many of the children and families that we care deeply about, that are a part of our circle of regard and compassion, are experiencing the ripple effects of this pandemic in disproportionate ways. And the reason for that is because of another pandemic, a pandemic that's been hidden in plain sight for centuries, the pandemic of structural inequities and structural racism that truly has set the foundation for many of the disparities that COVID-19 simply widened, simply expanded and extended. And it has been a humbling reality for many of us to face where are we in our own journey to understand the impact of racism in our communities on the health, the well-being, the life chances, and the quality of our entire human experience. And hidden within these pandemics are children. And the questions that we have about how they are faring during this time and what the future will hold for them. So we come to this conversation with real intentionality about thinking from our spheres of influence individually and collectively. What can we do for children? What is the right thing to do for children? And how do we work collectively to really address these pandemics that, simply ignoring will only strive to bring us further down the road of complications. So I invite us into this space to really think about what's essential, as we talked about so often, essential workers. Who's considered essential now? Well, educators have really been brought into that light in a whole new, radically new way. And what are our goals and intentions around really supporting the structures, the supports, the relationships, and the system level changes needed so educators can also bring their best to every child and really promote the promise and potential of every child. So I'm excited for this discussion today, and I appreciate you all being here and being in community.
Wow, thank you so much for that warm welcome. I should say that I have a few more remarks that I wanted to share about you. Dr. Renee Boyden-Jarrett is a pediatrician and a social epidemiologist who created a community engagement network for families. Importantly, she's also a mom. And thank you again for that welcome. We look forward to hearing from you throughout this conversation about the importance of meaningful relationships and building a safe environment for our children where they're trusting of the adults in their environment, both teachers, educators, families alike. So thank you so much. Marianne, I'm sorry. Would you be willing to talk to us a little bit? I'd like to introduce you as well before you get started. Dr. Wolf is a neuroscientist and literacy advocate at and the director of the Center for Dyslexia for Diverse Learners at UCLA. Dr. Wolf has done extensive research on the reading brain, and her latest work, Reader Come Home: The Reading Brain in the Digital World, is a must read. And also, we're so excited to hear from you tonight, a beloved friend of the Speech School, as is Dr. Renee Boyden-Jarrett.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you, Comer and Sandra and Dan and all the amazing people at Rollins Center and the Atlanta Speech School for giving me this opportunity to speak to and with Renee and with all the parents and educators who I'm so glad that you have come to join us, as Renee said, a community to think about what we can all do. And my particular sphere of influence is literacy, and how literacy becomes one of our major vehicles for redressing inequities. And so I want to actually begin at the beginning. Most people don't realize that the reading brain begins at infancy, not at 5 or 6, it begins in the cradle. It's like the room where things happen is the nursery. And here's where I want to say just a few things to parents who are listening. If I had 3 words or 5 words to offer as advice, it would be read, speak, and sing to your child every day as a ritual. If I had 2 more, it would be love and laugh with your children while you are reading, speaking, and singing. We know a great deal about how the brain emerges from cognitive neuroscience, from pediatric neurologists. But I want you to know that the beauty of reading begins with parents and caretakers and siblings under the crook of an arm, because that's where the tenderness, the affection, and the love becomes associated with the act of reading. And even though parents often say to the pediatricians and reach out and read, why should I read? My child doesn't understand. Well, they understand so much more than you think. And it begins with appreciation of the sounds of our language, whatever that first language is. We are building representations in the brain of those sounds, and the sounds become blended into words, and words become stories. And I know some of you believe that you never want to hear "Good night, moon" again, much less read it for the 100th time. But I assure you, so much is happening when you read to your child. And my colleagues at Cincinnati Hospital for Children, like Dr. Hutton, are showing in brain imaging that those children who are read to are literally having areas of the brain for language be more activated. And we have all kinds of interesting studies that are coming out to show us that the simple, taken for granted act of reading does so much for language development, for conceptual development, for the background knowledge that we want our children to bring to kindergarten, and also something very special. Every time a child hears something like what Frog does when Toad is sick, or what George and Martha do when one of them is in trouble, teaches the child to leave the natural egocentrism of childhood, to try on the feelings and thoughts of another. This is what I and others call the moral laboratory of the 0 to 5 period, that we as parents and educators can do so much about. And perhaps if there are pieces of silver lining, one of them is that we have more time to invest in this act of reading and talking and singing and being with our child as a ritual that's connected with love. So I can't be more excited actually about all the things that we can do between 0 to 5 that prepare, that form the parts of the reading brain that later, as teachers, we help the child connect. That's enough for now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Marianne. I want to go back to Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett for just a second to talk a little bit about, so Dr. Wolf is talking about this moral laboratory and this building of background knowledge and building of sound awareness and building of empathy. How do we find our way into a child's space during this really, really difficult time where kids are out of routine, families are out of routine? How do we find our way into a child's mind and heart and brain, as Dr. Wolf is sharing during this difficult time?
So I so appreciate your comments, Dr. Wolf, and your enthusiasm, because there is truly so much potential, and that's the power of early childhood. It is also the risk, right? There we know that children in the first 3 to 5 years of life, their brains are developing in ways and at a speed that it will not in the future. It will continue to develop, it will continue to grow and transform, but the openness, the readiness, the sponginess of really all of those social experiences actually shaping the architecture of who this child is becoming and how they are beginning to understand the world is profound in that early childhood period. And we know that it truly begins with relationships. So the attachment is a fundamental part of the foundation for all of your ability to gain new skills, to gain mastery on anything in life, including reading, speaking, interacting, moving. So attachment really forms the base. It forms the foundation for a child to feel as though they can begin to explore and interact with the world. And those attachment relationships build a number of capacities for children. It establishes a sense of trust. This caregiver is going to be here when I have a need. Not that I will not have any needs, not that I won't face challenges or adversities, but when I have a need, there is someone who is reliable in my world who will be responsive to me and my needs. It's a really important distinction we sometimes misunderstand around how important parents are as their children's first teacher. It's not that you are the problem solver and the knower of everything. It is that you are a consistent, caring, responsive adult in the world of a child. And your ability to be responsive is so tremendously more important than your ability to know the right things. And so in this time of ambiguity and uncertainty, caregivers, educators, parents, we are often concerned that we don't have the right answers for children, and that sometimes pulls us out of deep, intimate relationships. We actually should lean into deep, intimate relationships during this period of uncertainty, because that presence and responsiveness is what's protective, not having the answers. So this begins from very, very early on in infancy, establishing secure, stable, reliable connections. You send a signal out, it will be responded to. That becomes a motivator for continuing to interact within the world. And this shapes actually the developing brain. It shapes the expression of our genetics and our biology. So, and it deeply impacts our ability to regulate our emotions. So if emotions are not able to be regulated or are dysregulated, or a child is experiencing an environment where they don't feel safe, they don't know what to expect, they don't feel a sense of trust and reliability in their relationships, that your brain will bias its attention to safety. So you won't have the capacity to actually learn and obtain new information, because your focus will be on safety. Your focus will be on, I'm not sure what's happening next, so I have to pay attention to see what's happening next, not learning new skills, not interactive in creative ways in your environment. So the attachment relationships are vitally important to a sense of safety and establishing a sense of trust so that you can build other relationships, build new skills and mastery. Finally is the sense of power and control. So like each individual has natural qualities that make you who you are as a human being, right? So some aspects of our dignity as people are because you are a person and you can make decisions and you exist in the world. But many aspects of our dignity are actually influenced by how the world treats you. So if you exist in a society where you feel invisible, Your needs are invisible. Your pain and your anguish is invisible. Your excellence, your intelligence, your ability is not regarded in the society. That chips away at your sense of dignity. Because dignity cannot just be created within an individual, it's created in relationships. So when we talk about the twin pandemics, when we talk about the deep impact of what can happen with structural racism, it isn't, we usually, as soon as racism is mentioned, we stop the conversation right there because it becomes, oh, it's just about people being racist. Well, what I'm talking about in the life of the child is all of the ways in which a society can demonstrate to you you don't matter. You don't matter quite as much. Your pain is not a priority for us. Your dreams are not a priority. Your voice and your experience is not a priority. You're not being seen. And children get that message very, very early on in life. They often get it in part through the experiences that their caregivers have navigating the social world, and then the experience and treatment that they can have as they begin to enter additional social environments like preschools and religious institutions and other areas within our society. And so at the end of the day, in order to really tap into that reading brain, that profound potential that children have that Dr. Wolf is speaking of, we actually have to care for that individual in a much more holistic and comprehensive way. And most of those signals are nonverbal. Most of those are the signals society is sharing with you. Are you beautiful? Are you valuable? Are you intelligent? What are our expectations for you? And as Dr. Wolf shared, we often don't think about reading until kids are much older. So if we don't have expectations that an infant actually has the capacity to begin thinking in a way that builds the foundation for reading, we won't invest in it. And so that's another part of acknowledging the dignity and humanity of children.
Wow. Wow.
One great answer.
I mean, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I want to just remind our audience to continue, our participants to continue to post questions on the different platforms. We're going to get to those questions. Dr. Boynton-Jarrett just shared a lot. If I could just synthesize and think about what you just said, what I hear is that attachment, meaningful relationships are the gateway into this moral laboratory that Dr. Wolf is talking about. That the only way to get in there is for children to feel safe and to know that they can trust the adults in their environment at school and at home. So, wow, as Dr. Wolf said, great answer. And we hope that people will continue to post questions because we're going to get to those. Dr. Wolf, I wanted to go back to you for a second. So given the discussion that just took place, how in the birth to 5 space, so you mentioned reading, you mentioned singing, spending time interacting. How, I guess this is a 2-part question. Can you give us more on how we build the moral laboratory and share with us more precursors for literacy? So you gave us background knowledge, you gave us sound awareness. What else should kids, should our families be striving to build in their babies who will soon become readers?
So I'm going to do something that I usually don't do. I'm going to tell you 2 things. One, when I set out to write my first book, which was called Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain, I said, what is the most important thing that I can do? And so I wrote the first chapter, even though it became chapter 4, reading begins under the crook of an arm. That's where it all begins. it begins, and this is, Renee and I I've never had the privilege of interacting like this. But the reality is we are looking at that reading brain from very similar beginnings. Because even if we look at the neuroscience data, when the brain sets down memory, the first aspects are not just the hippocampus, it's the amygdala, the areas of feeling, emotional memories are being set down first. So what we give when we literally give our own love of reading, we communicate that. Stories are the most beautiful, simple vehicle for not just conveying the information, but conveying love and trust, just as Renee has said. But there are specifics that I want to emphasize, because one of the most important aspects of this town hall is to have antidotes to the inequities that do not begin at 5, but begin from the start. And they begin in places like hospitals. And I know the Cox Campus and all kinds of efforts like Talk to Me Baby that happens in Georgia and other places, and there are campaigns like First 5 in California. It's about what are you doing when you are reading or talking to your child. Quite literally, you have words that continue to grow. It's not just that you hear one word and you know it. You begin a continuum of knowledge about a word that is connected to concepts. This is connected to the background knowledge that a child either brings or doesn't bring at 5 to the kindergarten door. And let's go even deeper into that. If we look at some of the old research studies and new ones where brain imaging is added, and we look at the children who hear words in their environment over and over again, the children from many a privileged home end up hearing 30 million more instances of words than children from non-privileged homes. This is not about money equals vocabulary. This is about emphases that we can change in every community, and that parents need to know this. I'm very, very and Renee, you know this so well, but the Reach Out and Read pediatricians are doing their part by giving at every well visit a book. Well, what is that book doing? The book is really not just a matter of teaching the child, it's teaching the parent how rituals of reading add to the vocabulary. The vocabulary of children cannot have chasms of difference at age 5. Later on, I'm going to be potentially mentioning intervention I've done with an Atlanta researcher, Robin Morris, and my colleague Maureen Lovett, in which we were able to intervene and make differences, and the learning curve was the same no matter what SES, what race, what IQ, but the gap that began was before we began our studies in 2nd grade. The gaps are beginning in 0 to 5, when we are not, as a society, working to be sure that words become the natural environment. And I'm not using words only from a linguistic viewpoint. When we talk about the reading brain, we're talking about parts that have to be developed before you get to 5. Well, language areas, knowing the sounds, the phonemes, knowing the meanings, knowing how words work, knowing the nuances of words and what the melody either conveys or doesn't convey. All this can happen between parent and child. And Renee talked about responsiveness. This is a really inordinately important part. And it has to do with some of the, if you will, bad uses of technology. The responsiveness of a parent with a child reading or talking is that they can ask the question, they can elaborate, they can ensure the child knows what that word means or how it's being used. A study shows that if you do the same story in an audio form or a video form with all the bells and whistles versus us, the person, the parent, the caretaker, the child's language regions in brain imaging are more activated. So when we're talking about all the parts, one of the things that always surprises me in the audience is that I'm talking about the language regions that have to be developing between 0 to 5, the cognitive, the concepts, all of which happens and builds conceptual or background knowledge. But I'm also talking about affect. What does that make you feel? I'm even talking about motoric regions. The more you know about reading, the more beautifully complex it teaches us about what our mind does. And I will just say to all of us, even though I'm not probably supposed to talk about adults or experts, but when an expert reader reads Anna Karenina or Huck Finn or any instance in which the heroine is jumping or leaping, we do too. Our motor regions leap. That brain's connectedness is one of the most beautiful things we're doing between 0 and 5. We're making language alive for our children. We're making emotions and concepts connected so that the inequities that I experience, including in Atlanta research with Robin Morris, that gap that happened before we get in, we can do something about. That's what these town halls, I think, can really do something very, very special. We need to change what happens between 0 and 5 for all our parents.
Wow.
It's your turn now.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I want to add to what you've just talked about, because you're exactly right, Marianne, that the purpose of this town hall, this 2-part town hall, is to say enough is enough. We're not going back to the old ways in which we've been with children. As caregivers, as family members, as educators, we have to be new. We have to be better for our children and with our children. And so this convening this afternoon and this coming together is all about that. It's all about that. How can we be? As a mom of a 4-year-old, I'm always asking, what can I do better? Is what I'm doing enough? Because all of us want what's best for our child. And I'm grateful to be on both sides, the educator and as a parent. But it is true that the reason that we're here tonight is exactly what you just spoke to. This is what this convening is all about. Renee, did you want to jump in? I'm sorry.
I love what Dr. Wolf shared about how, smart interventions do work. They do work, and you can see growth for children across the spectrum. But that gap, where does that come from?
Yeah.
Where does that gap come from? And I just want to speak to that for a minute in the light of our twin pandemics, right? Parents in general want the same things for their children. They want them to have a promising future. They want them to fulfill their dreams. They want to give the best of everything to them. So if we're seeing a gap in early childhood, where is that coming from? And Dr. Wolf mentioned, what is our social responsibility, right? To really make sure that families have what they need. And I want to take a step back and talk a little bit. I spoke a little bit earlier around early childhood being this incredible time. We've also learned a lot about the impact of social adversities and traumas, particularly in the earliest periods of life. how do toxic stressors, so what do I mean by that? I mean really stressful experiences, really difficult experiences that don't have adequate buffering. So a parent that may have complex substance abuse issues, complex mental health issues, living in a situation with chronic poverty, housing, food insecurity, these all can be very toxically stressful experiences for children, particularly when there is an inadequate way to buffer that experience, to explain it, to work through it. And so these toxic stressors impact development for children. And when we think about what's happening around the country, around police brutality, and the relationship between law enforcement and communities, for many parents, it is incredibly challenging for any child to witness a caregiver being harmed in any way. So witnessing a caregiver's arrest or witnessing any kind of force or violence against a caregiver can be an incredibly traumatic experience for a child. Witnessing this happen to caregivers who look like yours on television can be incredibly traumatic, troubling experiences for young children, adolescents, and youth, as well as adults. So research has shown this impacts mental health. There are spillover effects of our public experiences of these types of acts of violence against unarmed Black Americans. There are spillover effects on the mental health and well-being of caregivers, as well as on their children. And so when we're thinking about as a society, what our set of practices are, what our set of what our contract is as with public servants, and what's truly at stake, many of the experiences that aren't coming to the surface are some of the impacts of trauma that are experienced differently depending on your race, ethnicity, and society. So your risk of being exposed to this type of trauma will vary depending on race, ethnicity. And so it really calls us into a larger social contract and question about what could be contributing to the gaps that appear very, very early on. Why might a parent encourage a child to talk less? Why might a parent from a very young age encourage a child to be less vocal? Is it for a reason to protect them? And what is the cost? What is the true cost to humanity? So we have to begin to engage in these very complex discussions that really involve all of us. This isn't about racism enacted by one group against another group. This degree of structural racism, actually, we're all participating in different ways. So it really calls us to think about, for the benefit of our children and for our goals as a society, what do we really need to do differently, and how are these things fundamentally interrelated?
I want to pick up on fundamentally interrelated, Dr. Boynton-Jarrett, because you reminded me that the same study that showed this 30 million word chasm was redone several ways and several times, looking at a qualitative analysis of the data. And my colleague John Gabriele at MIT and others there have been looking at the fact, well, several people, Catherine Hirsch-Pasek, they're looking at the words that a lot of our families are using are safety words. Don't do this, be careful, so that it's not just quantitative differences, but there are these qualitative differences that have so much to do with the environment and the adversity that they are trying to shield the children from. So one of the things that I think we need to be able to talk to parents about is that kind of language, while necessary, needs also to be accompanied by the elaboration of language for their children. So it's, you know, it's not that we We must not stop protecting our children with language that protects, but we must, in addition, be aware of this other use of language that's so important. Actually, I have one other, there's thing that, so many things you make me think of. It's a good thing that Ryan is here to stop us. But one of my colleagues in Boston has done various films developmentally about children, and now she did one on Aging of America. But the one about the children in America was so much centered on the effects of trauma in 0 to 3 and 0 to 5 on teenage cognitive development. So this connection between what you and I are hoping happens and what is prevented from happening because of trauma and adversity, it affects the lifespan. And if we have people listening who are thinking about the economic aspects of this, there are analyses by, certainly at the University of Chicago and by so many others, by economists who say the more we invest, they use this return for investment terminology, the biggest bang for the buck is when you can develop that 0 to 5 period, so that all of these areas are being developed, so that later on we don't have delinquency, we don't have kids who are not developing their potential because of all these things that happen in their early childhood. So I wish we could give links to all of these things, but maybe that's another service we can suggest later.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. This conversation, and I know we have to get to Q&A, but I want to bring this up because what I hear in this theme, in the conversation that's taking place, is that really social and emotional health and well-being and access to language and literacy is really a fundamental right, should be something that comes standard for all of our children, right? And what I hear in the dialogue is that parents, caregivers, and educators really have the power to give our babies in the birth to 5 space what they need through meaningful interactions, through attachment, into the moral laboratory, and building these skills really early on that will benefit children as they grow older. So this is just very exciting. Yes.
I can't help myself, but one of the things that Dr. pointed out is that it's not just the parents, it's all of us have to work together. Who has time when they have 2 jobs to be doing all that I'm trying to suggest? We as a society have to work to help this. And I will add one little thing to what you said in where I work at UCLA. It's the Center for Dyslexia Diverse Learners and Social Justice, because literacy is just what you said. And I know Comer and Sonder and everybody in your center uses this term. It's a basic human right. And we don't have that. We have neglected our child, our families, our communities, and our society as a whole.
Right. Because as you mentioned, the economic impact on our society is so great. And of course, this moral and ethical responsibility that we have, but it just speaks more to why, as you're saying, all of our communities, in the entire community, needs to be involved in building up a child, being better with children in the birth to 5 space.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'm going to get to a few questions here. And I'll start with I'll continue with questions, and then a sort of wrap-up statement for this part of our town hall. Then we'll take a quick recess and come back. So one of the questions that we have, and I wanted to ask, and this is really a question for both of you, how do we know, how as educators and as families and as a community, how do we know that our children feel safe? how do we know that our children trust the adults in the environment, be it school or at home or in our community, anywhere in our community? How do we know? How can you tell that that a child is feeling safe and trusting?
I think there's so many ways to think about it, depending on developmental age and stage of the child. But for children that are verbal, I think if they say they're upset or they say something doesn't feel right, I always say believe them. Believe them. It may not seem logical. It may not seem rational. You may not understand the reason. For children who are not yet verbal, I always say every behavior has a reason. There's no behavior that is there just to be a behavior. So crying, tantruming, pulling away, becoming very upset, it is not there just to be a bad behavior. It is there for a reason. And so if we see a behavior in a child that we don't quite understand, it's important not to just respond to the behavior, but to really look for the reason, to really try to look at things through their perspective to understand what may have affected their sense of trust or safety. We know common things that can undermine this can be unexplained transitions. So early child care provider is there one day and is gone the next day, and there's someone new and there's no explanation, there's no preparation for that transition, and there's no opportunity to mourn or address it. And so children have that range of emotion. They're not often given the space to actually go to express that range of emotions. So when we think about the change in routines that they may have no sense of control over, but it's just suddenly routines are changed, suddenly daycare is closed, suddenly everything is different. Children can adapt to transitions. They can be flexible, they can change, but it's important to support them and the range of emotions that are healthy to express during that time as well. So I say just really paying attention complexity of emotions that children can express and how dialed in they are to the emotions of their caregivers and providers. Because sometimes children are reacting to anxiety and stress that a caregiver actually is displaying or that an educator is displaying.
Yeah. Uh-oh, I think we're having a little bit of tech challenge. But Dr. Wolf, did you have anything to add to that question?
I would just love to leave Dr. Boynton-Jarrett's answer intact.
Yeah.
Just because you want me to say something, I will emphasize something she said.
Okay.
And that is the listening. When we listen carefully, and that takes time sometimes that we don't have. It takes energy, especially when you think at the end of a caretaker's day or end of a parent's day who's been working, and you sometimes just don't have the time or the energy to listen. But to take an extra effort to find out why they seem to be crying, especially, or why the light in their eye seems to be dimmer during a transition. I think the light of the eye and the quality of attention that we get to know in each child, those are gauges. And I think to listen and look at those two aspects, I think I couldn't agree with you more, Dr. Joyton. Jarrett, by the end of this time, you're gonna call me Dr. Fox, and I'm gonna call you God knows what.
I want to ask another question, and Marianne, you can start off on this one. As we're thinking about technology, and you touched on it just a little bit, and of course, at this time, babies in the birth to 5 space, toddlers, they're at home with caregivers, they're at home with families. How can we meaningfully engage with children around technology?
Right. So this
Is there a way?
So I'm just going to say, I am working so hard to try to understand contradictory truths about technology and the human interaction. Because, and there's a philosopher named Nicholas of Cusis who said that when we have two contradictory truths, we have to take a stance of what he called learned ignorance. So I am trying to understand the research, and I have been doing some of it over the last several years. A lot of my colleagues are doing this research as well. But I think there are certain principles that I would like to indicate that at this moment of time, tethered as we all are to our devices, and I mean that, all of us are tethered, try to avoid using digital devices for children under 1.5 years, if possible. Not to outlaw them, not to make them a reward or a punishment of any sort by taking them away, but rather to only gradually introduce them and never use them as a babysitter. One of the things that I have learned actually from a researcher from India who was called the Slumdog Professor, and he put computers in holes in the wall, and he believed that, you know, the children were going to just learn so much just by being exposed. Well, what he found out was what he called the granny effect, that a human with the interaction with the technology for the young was especially important. So I would, in my ideal world, I would be developing what I call a biliterate reading brain from the start, in which from 0 to 5, technology is there and used in good ways. And there are many good ways that one can use it, but not without an adult in some relationship to it, so that the adult knows how it's being used, and only gradually till around 5 to 7, used in any seriously long amount of time. Now, when we get to the next section, I will say that my hope is that at 5, digital devices can be used for what they are so amazing: teaching programming, coding, complementary basis of knowledge. They're practice for our struggling readers. So I'll go into that more in our second half. But from 0 to 5, my hope is that the tactile, kinesthetic aspect of reading and how it's shared with the parent, the caretaker, is the best way for us. If I could analyze all that research, and Naomi Barron is doing that right now, that's what the research is telling us. The bells and whistles are less good for language development than the interaction with a parent in a book or speech or, you know, creative sessions. So it's a very complex topic, and there are individual differences, and we'll get into the individual differences, especially in the second half. But, you know, there's nothing like the reaction and responsiveness of a parent and a child.
Yes, thank you. So I will just, we're gonna bring this part to a close. But I just want to re-emphasize for our audience or for our participants who may not stay on for the second half, if you don't have a baby in the K to 3rd space, but of course everyone is welcome to stay and listen. It sounds like what I hear is, because I know a lot of our educators who are also caregivers and parents are wondering the most important thing that they can do during this time, or any time, our entire community, is to stay engaged, continue the human interaction, continue to develop and build attachments so that our children feel safe, that they trust the adults in their environment, and that their reading brains are open and prepared to receive. So thank you guys so much. Thank you everyone who is with us on Facebook and different platforms. Just hang with us. We're going to be talking more about meaningful interactions, relationships, more about what all of this means as we continue on the path of building a reading brain in the K to third space and what educators and families can do.